process. That's just not true.
Well, first of all, there are huge majority of people are undocumented young men. Secondly, secondly, the people who are on the high streets that were documented by the media, which I'm sure you trust the BBC if you don't trust me, showed that they were being run by, as part of a criminal gang racket, using illegal migrants who were failed asylum seekers who disappeared into this.
What happens when right-wing media outlets try to manufacture local outrage over asylum seeker accommodation while ignoring human rights and international obligations? You get the exact spectacle that played out in this broadcast. Broadcasters brought on a local campaigner to confront a labor representative, attempting to frame the housing of vulnerable asylum seekers in local hotels as a betrayal of local communities and state gaslighting. Instead of engaging with the massive backlog and broken asylum processing system left behind by 14 years of Tory misrule, the hosts and activists focused on fear-mongering and scapegoating, rather than acknowledging that Labour is working to process applications humanely, clear the backlogs, and end costly temporary hotel contracts. Right-wing commentators weaponized local anxieties to score cheap political points against the government. Let's look at how this intense broadcast exchange unfolded. This video breaks down the key moments, the arguments, and the questions everyone is talking about. Watch until the end and tell me what you think in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next update.
Can you just explain what impact, if any, there's been on the residents of Crowborough because of the opening up of this site?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll be heading back early on Saturday, given the latest news that will be coming out. But yeah, no problems. So the impact on residents has been huge. You know, we know that what Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, is saying is that she's going to be closing down asylum hotels because of the awful impact that it's having on communities, you know, crime, tensions, and it's destroying the social fabric. So the impact here is much greater because what you're doing is you're putting much larger numbers in a concentrated area with no infrastructure. There are no amenities here for these people. And what this town is feeling is an increase in police. So there are police everywhere, but parents are afraid to let their children walk home from school because of all of the things that we see in the media, whether it's a perceived fear or a real fear. It's genuinely felt by this community. And that is changing people's ways of life. They're altering their ways of life. There is lots of unlit areas in Crowborough, which, crimes can go unnoticed and unheard in these areas. So of course, people, residents, families, they're changing their way of life. We've already seen that small businesses have been affected because we had a private dental firm that had taken on the asylum seekers for their dental treatment. Well, we all know how difficult it is to get a dentist appointment. So actually, they've done a U-turn and said, we won't be offering this service to the asylum seekers. So, it's causing tensions beyond belief across the whole of Crowborough.
You touched on it there. You said whether it's a real fear or a perceived fear. I mean, is that the problem? Some people would say that nothing untoward has happened. It's about sort of previous things that may or may not have happened, and that's been the problem.
Yeah, potentially. But what you've got to remember is we are taking this Home Secretary, the Home Office, to a judicial review. So all the time that we are prepping for that, you've got unlimited police. Crowborough never saw a police officer. If you saw a police car in Crowborough, you wondered what happened. Now you cannot go even a few minutes into the town. They are absolutely everywhere. So at the moment, crime is being deterred. You've got police everywhere. So any crime that could be committed is being prevented. As soon as this judicial review is over, whether we win or lose, those police are going to be pulled. We see that as a kind of a false narrative that there's nothing happened, no crimes have been committed. We know that the crime rates in these towns that have the asylum hotels, and that's 50 to 100 asylum seekers, the crime rates are much, much higher. Now imagine that you put in 600 and you're talking a turnover of thousands of people. So at the moment, she's able to create this, there are no problems. But as soon as this judicial review is over, the police will be pulled and you will see increased crimes.
OK, Kim, stay with us because I want to bring in the panel on all of this, particularly Jessica. You've been calling for these hotels to be closed, haven't you, in your constituency? What do you say to Kim?
Yeah, really interesting, look, Kim, to hear about how it's affected Crowborough, and obviously the protests will be a reason that lots of police are in the area as well. We as a government committed to closing hotels. There were more than 400 in the country before we took office. There are now fewer than 200. I have two in my constituency, and I have been very upfront with my constituents that I want to see them closed. I don't think they're good for the people in them. I don't think they're good for our community, and they are terrible for the taxpayer as well. And I agree that it would be mad for us to simply move people into different type of accommodation, but that's not the full picture. The number of asylum seekers has gone down by a half in my constituency. That's because we are now processing claims that the Conservatives allowed to just build up. We have deported more than 60,000 people with no right to be in the UK. And we are looking at more secure and dispersed accommodation so that it isn't impacting town centres in the way that it has. And we've put in place deals with France, Germany, the Western Balkans, Iraq to stop the criminal networks. And we've prevented more than 42,000 boat crossings coming over. I do have to take issue with the crime stats because in my town it doesn't bear up. There's a lot of noise online about asylum seeker crime stats, lots of misinformation and lies about it. That doesn't help anybody. Look, we all want to make sure that we've got an immigration system that works, that we've got communities that feel safe and protected, but stirring up anger about asylum hotels is not the way to do that.
Kim, what do you say to that?
No, I completely agree with that. You don't want to stir up the problems. But what you've just said there about more affordable accommodation and that this is better for the taxpayer, we know it's not. 3 million just to set Crowborough up, 4 million to create Clear Springs, 2.64 million for the MOD to hand the site over, 5.62 million to police it, and then you've got 80 to 90,000 pounds per day. We know that this actually costs somewhere around 4 to 5 times more than it does to house them in asylum hotels. So that does not withstand scrutiny. And it's one of the things, that we are challenging. In terms of deporting figures, that's a real disingenuous figure because they are being deported, but how many of them actually return? I think you'll find that is a significantly high number. Moving problems from one town, essentially what you're doing is you're creating 5 giant potholes to fill 20 small ones. That's not a solution. That's just moving a problem and creating bigger problems in concentrated areas.
OK, let Jessica answer that before I bring in the others.
I mean, I think we just fundamentally disagree on some of the facts and figures and also the impacts. Look, we ultimately want there to be no people in asylum accommodation, and I think we would agree on that. And we're trying to get there in the best possible way we can. We were dealt a really bad hand. We're doing everything we can to pull that down. But it's not a question of snapping your fingers and changing it overnight. So at least, Kim, I hope you can see that we are trying to address the real issues that people have raised with us. I'm doing it in my constituency, and we're trying to get to an outcome where we don't have these large numbers of people living in limbo and upsetting our communities.
Processing people is also misleading because you actually can just get people box ticked through and given asylum, and that's one thing that's great concern. These are, whether they're processed as being legitimate, they're still undocumented young males. I mean, they might be legitimate because some lawyer says so, but actually nobody knows who they are. So there's a problem. The BBC have done a fantastic job recently, by the way, of exposing what's happening on high streets with illegal vape shops and in some instances, and some horrendous stories of where even grooming gangs are taking place in those shops. High streets have been taken over by illegal migrants who are not being deported. Because the other thing is, if you actually fail to get your asylum sorted, what's the mechanism for deporting people? It doesn't exist. And whenever I've asked in the House of Lords, are they being deported? No, the figures aren't even there. So in terms of the kind of culture of fear or who's stirring up tensions, I would like to point out that one of the reasons why the asylum hotels were brought into public attention was because the public organised demonstrations and protests. It's wrong to suggest they were the problem. If it wasn't for the public, and God, what a wonderful advocate Kim is in terms of the kind of conversation she's started today, well-informed. People were rightly concerned that their whole community was being transformed in this way. And in terms of the number of crimes and, of course, some very horrendous sexual crimes and violent crimes that are documented. The point is, they've been carried out by people who shouldn't be in the country. That's the point. So you can't kind of say, oh, it's just whipping up fear and we've got to be careful about how we pose this.
But Claire, you've literally just done that by saying it's just men. All the illegals on the high street are doing it. It's box tick through. There's no process. That's just not true.
Well, first of all, there are huge majority of people are undocumented young men. Secondly, the people who are on the high streets that were documented by the media, which I'm sure you trust the BBC if you don't trust me, showed that they were being run by as part of a criminal gang racket using illegal migrants who were failed asylum seekers who disappeared into the system. Only today, I think they've admitted they've lost 50,000, right? That the Home Office has admitted. So what I'm suggesting is that this is not control of our borders. And I'm not blaming the Labour Party. I've got plenty to say about the Conservative Party. I'm talking about the legitimate concerns of British citizens in relation to this. The only other thing is, it is the case that because it's so slow, it will be the case that people will have to go somewhere.
Yeah, so where do they go?
But the problem we have got is the moving the ships around the Titanic is right. I'm just saying that we're not going to the fundamental problem. And then there's houses of multiple occupancy, which is where you say, oh, well, there's not that many. We'll just take over the housing of the local area. And so all of the things that have been put into place, and I thought the dentist example was a brilliant one, which is these people are being given services and support from the British state that people who live in this country of all ethnicities.
I need Jessica needs to have a chance to respond to this.
That's a problem.
And look, we agree that we have to respond to the legitimate Conservative people, which is why we're trying to get the numbers down, to process the backlog, to move people out of hotels. But I don't think it serves anyone when we whip up a storm about access to services and lies about crime rates.
It's not lies, and it's not whipping up a storm.
That's wrong.
Okay, let's let Kim in because she's waiting patiently.
This is the constant narrative that we've had from this government, which is constantly gaslighting communities because they have genuine fears. This Home Secretary, Alex Norris, the Minister, did not consult with Crowborough about any of this. It was all done underhanded, all sneaked in the cover of darkness. And even Alex Norris went to the Home Affairs Select Committee and said he failed Crowborough. He failed what he was doing. Now, the announcement that they're going to be making about changes, again, there has been no consultation. And it's getting really tiring the way that this government, including yourself here today, is gaslighting communities. These are not made up figures. The figures that I have will come from Freedom of Information and other reliable sources, which I'm not at liberty to talk about. Obviously, we do have a legal case going. So these are not made up figures, and this constant gaslighting needs to stop because all it's doing is infuriating people and stirring up the problems that you claim are being stirred up by us. But actually, you do need to look at how this government is communicating with the people in which it's affecting.
Okay, let Jessica respond to that. Jessica.
Yeah, and I would say on the point of consultation, like I don't know anything about that, and fair enough that communities should be asked and be part of a process. I am also not saying that there is no crime associated with asylum seekers. I'm trying to provide a really balanced view here on, and I get the frustration, like people aren't meant to be here, they don't have their claims processed yet, and we're seeing elements of crime. But what I'm faced with in my constituency is people making up lies about blaming asylum seekers for things that they haven't done. And we're just missing the humanity in all of this of people who, and a lot of them who have left their countries because of persecution, not all of them, obviously. That's why we're trying to get to the bottom of this. But it doesn't serve any of us if we're just whipped up into this fervour instead of trying to focus on how we really solve these problems.
Kim?
Okay, but that's exactly what you're doing. You're saying because it's not in my constituency, it's not anywhere else. But actually, it is. And what you're doing by saying because it's not in your constituency, you're then gaslighting the rest of the country.
I'm not saying that.
Now,
I'm not saying there's no crime in my constituency, but I'm not saying it's at the levels that some people are making up that it is.
But that's not the
It is
general,
a lot higher. We know it is a lot
trend.
higher, but to keep saying that it's not is not helpful to anyone.
Okay, just
you can't address the problem if you're not having the true facts presented.
What we just witnessed in this 16-minute broadcast is a prime example of how right-wing media channels weaponize localized anxieties to build a narrative of fear, division, and bad faith political outrage. by framing a local activist's confrontation with a labor representative as a stand against government gaslighting. Channels like Politics and Brits are actively obscuring the real, structural causes behind the UK's asylum challenges. First, let's look at the core dishonesty in the right-wing framing of the asylum-hotel crisis. Right-wing commentators routinely act as though the placement of asylum seekers in hotels is a deliberate, malicious policy choice by progressive leaders to undermine local communities. In reality, the heavy reliance on temporary accommodation is the direct consequence of 14 years of conservative underfunding, administrative failure, and a intentionally created processing backlog. When a system is stripped of resources, applications stall for years, forcing local councils and the Home Office into emergency housing measures. Labour's policy focus, clearing the processing backlog, cracking down on criminal human trafficking networks, and restoring a functional, humane immigration system, is the only realistic way to end hotel usage permanently. Second, examine the media tactics on display throughout this segment. Right-wing hosts deliberately elevate emotional personal anecdotes and inflammatory rhetoric, while actively shutting down systemic explanations. When the labor representative attempts to explain the legal obligations under international humanitarian law or the practical steps required to process claims fairly, they are accused of gaslighting the public. This is a bad faith rhetorical trap. If a progressive politician presents complex, real-world logistical facts, they are labeled out of touch. If they express empathy for vulnerable human beings fleeing war and persecution, they are accused of prioritizing non-citizens over locals. Furthermore, this confrontation highlights the dangerous hypocrisy of conservative anti-immigration rhetoric. The very political forces claiming to care about local community resources and public spending are the ones who supported a decade of brutal austerity measures that gutted local council budgets, slashed social housing funding, and degraded public infrastructure. Blaming asylum seekers, some of the most vulnerable people in the world, for the strain on local services is a classic scapegoating tactic designed to distract the public from decades of systemic underinvestment by the right wing. As progressives and defenders of human rights, we must continue to dismantle these reactionary media narratives. Solving complex global migration challenges requires competence, international cooperation, legal integrity, and compassion, not high-shouting television confrontations and political fear-mongering. Right-wing commentators don't want solutions to the asylum hotel issue because the ongoing frustration fuels their entire political business model. Standing up for fair, humane, and efficient state administration is the only way forward.